All right. So we got a 3-day weekend, so I'm glad some of you showed up. It looks like some are out barbecuing, so we're going to be trolling the neighborhood looking for someone barbecuing so I can get some free food. All right. Inside your program is an outline. Today we're going to look at the last of the hashtag hope, and this is part of last week's message. So we're going to do kind of a part 2. So if you missed last week, I'm not sure that there's any CDs. I think somebody had already gotten them all. You can always listen online and get caught up in the message today, all right? So we're going to go through the first part of the message quickly just to kind of get you caught up, and then we're going to look at point 3, and then today also we have the Lord's Supper, so we're going to celebrate that as well. So y'all ready? Yes. All right. So at the very top of the outline, we've been saying through the series that hope is not optimism. Optimism is what you believe that you can do. Optimism also has the idea of you kind of deny reality. Sometimes in life, it just isn't good, and it's just the reality. And so to kind of deny it is not really a good thing to do, and that's what optimism does. It kind of pushes it aside. You look at life through kind of a rose-colored glasses, and everything's wonderful. Hope, on the other hand, is theological. Hope is based on your personal trust in God. Hope is what you believe or what you think God can do. It's at 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 21, where it talks about our faith and our hope is in the resurrection of Christ. And so as believers, when we say hope, it's not like optimism, like, oh yeah, think good thoughts, good things will come your way. But our hope is rooted into the resurrection of Christ. We've said this through the series, that miracles, whether they be in the times that Jesus did it, or whether it be in Old Testament times, or even in today's world, miracles are to build our faith, which increases our hope. And so when we looked at the first several weeks, we looked at the miracles that Christ did. It was to build their faith, which would increase their hope, because hope is something that we need to have in our life. We talked about the byproducts of that in our life. Well, today we're going to go back to the Old Testament, to 1 Kings chapter 17. We're going to look at a miracle that God did in the life of Elijah. It's actually kind of 3, but we're going to just kind of package it all into one and go through it. So, just to give you a little background, if you weren't here last week, Elijah was about 900 years before Christ. He was a prophet that God had tapped on the shoulder to go and to confront King Ahab. King Ahab had allowed pagan worship into the area, and it became kind of the national religion. And so as a result of it, God told Elijah, I want you to go to King Ahab and his wife Jezebel. We have heard of her before. And we want you to go and confront him. And we want you to tell him that that's not acceptable. And because of his disobedience, and because he has entered into this pagan worship, God wasn't going to bring rain until he surrendered. So there was about a 3.5-year period where God didn't send any rain, and as a result of that, there was an incredible famine, recession in the land, and lots of people had hard times. And so, as God sends Elijah, he confronts him. The king Ahab said about Elijah, he said, you are a marked man, and basically we're going to kill you. And so God touches him. He goes to the Kerith ravine, where he hides out for a year. The promise in the Kerith ravine is that God was going to bring a raven in the morning and a raven at night to bring him food, and that he would have a brook to drink from during the day. And so he hung out in that area for 1 year. So let's go ahead and just look at one. There's no fill in the blanks yet, but let's get caught up in it. So the Kerith ravine was a place of gloom. It was a place of isolation. He was all alone. He had the birds that would deliver food, the brooks, that was it. And the word Kerith in the Hebrew means to be cut off or cut down. And so during times in our life, as we kind of translate into it and bring it into our life, God will oftentimes take us to a place where we're in complete isolation, where we don't have the support group of friends, we don't have maybe the financial support, and we just feel completely isolated. And as we said, that what God was going to do in the life of Elijah, he needed to do something in him, because later, this is the beginning of his ministry, later God was going to do something through him. And so he brought him to a place of isolation to begin to work in his life, because later he was going to do some amazing things for God. And so we looked at this last week, that God often in our faith journey will take us to places where we feel completely isolated and we're all alone. And all we have is God. We don't have a support group. We don't have the noise of the world. And we just feel completely isolated. And oftentimes in our life, we push back and we think, God, why are you angry at us? What did I do wrong? Well, in Elijah's case, and in many cases in our case, it's not anything that we've done wrong. He wants to get our attention, push away all the noise of the world, and just begin to focus completely and solely on him. And so as we look through each of these incidents that Elijah goes through, we find there is a similarity in our life as well. And so we learned a couple things from last week. We learned that the brook ended up drying up, and God had an idea of moving him on. So you have the 3 reasons why the brooks dry up in our life, and that was to keep Elijah from depending on the brooks, even though he was there for the year. God dried it up because he wanted for him not to depend on the raven and the water. Number 2 is God had a different place for him. He was going to send him to a different location. He dries it up to send him off into another place. Again, oftentimes in our life, when we feel like all of a sudden what we were depending on dries up, it's like, God, what are you doing? Oftentimes, whether it be spiritually, mentally, or physically, sometimes God dries up the creek to send us into a different direction. And we need to be aware of that. And then the last one on number 3 is that to prove that God hadn't forgotten of Elijah. Again, we sometimes think when the creek dries up and we're in complete isolation, it's like, God, why did you ignore me? And the reality is, he isn't ignoring you. He's paying attention to you. You might feel that way, but the reality is he is paying complete attention to you in your life. Then he sends him on, number 2 in your outline, is he sends him on a journey. And he goes north. He goes to Zarephath, which is an enemy territory for him. It's a place that he's going to go through the heartland of Baal worship. And remember, he's a marked man. He's confronted the king about Baal worship, and so God is going to take him from an isolation from the Keritha ravine, and he's going to send him north, and he's going to send him west, and he's going to go right through enemy territory. In fact, he's going to go to the place where Jezebel, King Ahab's wife, is from. And many people believe that Jezebel's family probably ruled that area. He was probably like a governor kind of thing. And so here God takes his man that he touched on his shoulders, and he sends him from a place of isolation to head north and west to go to Zarephath, where he's going to go through enemy territory, and God promises that he is going to protect him. And as he sends him on this road, it's a place of insecurity. And if you look with me in verses 8 and 9, it said the word of the Lord came to him. Verse 9, he says, go at once to Zarephath. And he says, and he told him to stay there. And he says, I have commanded a widow, and that's where we're going to pick up today. I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath, okay? So just to kind of get this caught up in our mind here, I'm going to shuffle through all my pages. What he does is he takes him to isolation, total focus on God. He's there for a year. The brook dries up. God didn't ignore him. God's paying attention to him. God wants to send him to a new location. And so he sends him to Zarephath. And I think we have the map from last week. Do we have that map from last week? We don't have the map from last week, all right? Well, let's just imagine we have a map. You ready? Close your eyes. Can you see it? All right? So Zarephath is on the northwest coast of the area. So he goes up, and then he heads over to the west coast. It was an area along the sea border, and that's where he is going to stay, and he's going to meet up with a widow, okay? So that's where we're going to pick up on number 3. Let's go through the real quick things on remembering, because we're going to look at one of these. The path to a miracle is always through uncomfortable territory, because when do you need a miracle? When life isn't going well, right? It's not when life is going wonderfully well and everything's perfect. That's not when you need a miracle. You need a miracle when the doctor says something, when someone says they're in ICU, when the kids are making bad choices, when the marriage is falling apart. That's when you need a miracle, right? You agree with that? So miracles come during uncomfortable times. Number 2, the source of a miracle is always unexpected, right? It's not the way that you think it should be. The moment that you figure out how God's going to work, He's not going to work that way. Right? So once I got him all figured out, I know exactly what he's going to do, He's like, I don't think so. Your ways are not my ways, right? My ways are not yours. As high as the heavens are from the earth, so is our ways different from God's ways. And then the third one is this. The pattern for a miracle, and we're going to pick up here, the pattern for a miracle is always command, promise, risk. Okay? Command, promise, risk. So this is about growing your faith. So God will give you a command. He says to Elijah, go to the Kerith ravine. The promise is the birds will feed you in the morning and at night. The risk is you got to be obedient. And then he tells him a year later, leave here. I want you to go to Zarephath. I want you to leave here. That's the command. The promise is a widow will take care of you. The risk is you got to go through enemy territory, through Jezebel's hometown, to stay where her father is, and you're a marked man. Are you going to be obedient? In our life as a faith journey, God is going to bring you to a place where He'll give you a command, He'll give you a promise, and the reality is, are you willing to take the risk to be obedient? If you do not take the risk to be obedient, you do not experience the miracle that builds your faith, that increases your hope. Are you following? Okay? So it's those burdens that God places on your heart, as Dale shared. You know, he had a burden to go to those folks. There's a command. The promise, whatever his promise was, and then the risk is, hey, are you going to take out? Are you going to go in an uncomfortable territory, a place that you don't know, to a people group that you don't know, but are you going to be obedient to it and walk in it? So number 3 in your outline. God is going to take him to Zarephath. And Zarephath in Hebrew means refinery. Okay? It means refinery. It is a refinery of scarcity in our life. All right? So again, these are faith steps that God is taking. He takes us to gloomy areas. He asks us to walk through insecure places where there's a safety issue. And then He's going to oftentimes take us to a place where there isn't the needs in our life that's being met, but we've got to trust Him to provide for us. All right? And as we go through these, He grows our faith because He provides for us in an amazing way. So we're going to pick up in verse 10. When he came to the town gate, a widow, remember he told him, you're going to go and a widow's going to take care of you. I commanded that to you, right? So he goes to the town gate, and a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and he asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? Verse 11. So as she was going to get it, he called out, and bring me, and I like it, please, right? Because whenever you say please, they got to do it. Isn't that right? Yeah. Please bring me a piece of bread. Now, this is kind of comical because he is going to go to a lady who is a widow. There's no social networks. There's no governmental agencies. There's none of that stuff. If you don't have extended family taking care of you, you're going to starve. There's a famine in the land, there's a recession in the land, there's a drought in the land. They're already having incredible trouble just living, even those who had. And so if you were a lady whose husband had passed away, unless you have a large family, you are really experiencing incredible hardship. God sends Elijah to her. And he asks her for a little bit of water, which isn't a problem. Dip it out of the well, not an issue. And by the way, can you give me something to eat? This would be like us going to someone who is begging, completely homeless, and going to them and say, hey, can you go buy me a sandwich at Togo's? Right? And by the way, light on the mayo, honey mustard, some peppers. Okay? I mean, that's kind of what it would be like. Going to the poorest of poor in our community and asking them, hey, can you take me to Red Lobster? Do you mind buying me something? So imagine, that look like, are you kidding me? This isn't it. But remember, the command, the promise, the risk. God commanded him to go. God commanded her to take care of him, and she doesn't even know who he is yet. Right? In her heart, he had already worked in her life. And so it's this command, promise, risk. Verse 12. And this is her response to him. As surely as the Lord, what's the word? Not her God. Remember, she's a pagan worshiper. The Lord, your God, lives. So she isn't even a Jew nor a believer. And God took Elijah to her. She replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in the jar and a little oil in the jug. All right? She got a little bit of oil, a little bit of flour. That's basically it. Now watch what she says. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home to make a meal for myself and my son that we may eat, and this is it. She's out. She's got one meal left in her. And she's going to go home and she's going to celebrate the last meal, and then her and her son are basically going to starve to death. And God sends Elijah to her. Now, from a human standpoint, all of us are sitting here thinking, that's not really a good idea. Why don't you send him to someone who's a king or someone who's incredibly wealthy, because they're going to be able to take care of it? But remember, this is a faith test for both Elijah and her, and she doesn't even know it yet. And so God oftentimes, as we're walking out our steps in faith, we want him to send us to the bank that has all the money that's willing to give it to us, and he sends us to the place where it's like, what exactly do you want me to do with that? How about a place